Welcome everyone to this webinar here at the University of Denver at the Joseph Korbel School of International Studies. My name is Timothy Sisk. I'm a professor at the Korbel School and director of the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies at the school. And we're very pleased to present this webinar this afternoon or evening, as your case may be, on the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize, which was announced this morning in Oslo at 11 a.m. there at the Norwegian Nobel Institute. And we put this webinar on to provide a same-day expert analysis of the 2020 Nobel Prize. And we're very pleased to have some really top specialists in the field of international peace and security who will be working us through the prize this year, to the World Food Program, and as well to giving some analysis as to, well, what does this prize mean for international peace and security in 2020, and a year in which we've seen a pandemic, wildfires, natural disasters, and indeed escalating conflict around the world. I wanted to welcome everyone, and particularly wanted to welcome our new students. I'll spend a quick moment to welcome everyone, but to say that we have 230 new Master of Arts students here at the university this quarter. We're very pleased to have such a robust class of new students, and we wanted to welcome them especially well. You know, 2020 has been quite a year, and I just wanted to note a report that came out of the organization UN Women about a month ago, which indicated that the pandemic would push into poverty as many as 47 million women and girls around the world. This is a dire crisis, and we know that women and girls, and indeed grandmothers and mothers, and are often involved in ensuring the resilience of the household. And without the resilience of the household, we know that communities are at risk. Here at the Korbel School, we're sponsoring this webinar together, as I mentioned, the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, together with the Siė Chėou Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy. And really pleased to be co-sponsoring this seminar with the Siė Center and my colleague, whom I'll introduce in just a moment, Deborah Avant, will be our moderator today. I'll just had a quick word of introduction on the event itself, just to refer to my friend and colleague's famous book. This is a friend and colleague, Geir Lundestad, the former executive director of the secretary, of the Norwegian Nobel Committee and esteemed historian, in his book on the Nobel Prize, the most prestigious prize, and highlights that the prize itself is both reflective of global conditions, but also shapes global conditions. And so this is a kind of the importance of the prize is not only its value in terms of prestige, but in the changes that it can lead to and the agenda setting in the international community. So before I introduce our moderator and speakers, I thought we should go to the Norwegian Nobel Institute, courtesy of YouTube, and we'll just take a look at the announcement this morning from Oslo. It runs about 5 minutes or so.
Good morning. The need for international solidarity and multilateral cooperation is more conspicuous than ever. The Norwegian Nobel Committee has decided to award the Nobel Peace Prize for 2020 to the World Food Program for its efforts to combat hunger, for its contribution to bettering conditions for peace in conflict-affected areas, and for acting as a driving force in efforts to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war and conflict. The World Food Programme is the world's largest humanitarian organization addressing hunger and promoting food security. Last year, the WFP provided assistance to close to 1 million people in 88 countries who are victims of acute food insecurity and hunger. In 2015, eradicating hunger was adopted as one of UN's Sustainable Development Goals. The WFP is the UN's primary instrument for realizing this goal. In recent years, the situation has taken a negative turn. In 2019, 135 million people suffered from acute hunger, the highest number in many years. Most of the increase was caused by war and armed conflict. The coronavirus pandemic has contributed to a strong upsurge in the number of victims of hunger in the world. In countries such as Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, South Sudan, and Burkina Faso, the combination of violent conflict and the pandemic has led to a dramatic rise in the number of people living on the brink of starvation. In the face of the pandemic, the World Food Programme has demonstrated an impressive ability to intensify its efforts. As the organization itself has stated, until the day we have a vaccine, food is the best vaccine against chaos. The world is in danger of experiencing a hunger crisis of inconceivable proportions if the World Food Programme and other food assistance organizations do not receive the financial support they have requested. The link between hunger and armed conflict is a vicious circle. War and conflict can cause food insecurity and hunger, just as hunger and food insecurity can cause latent conflicts to flare up and trigger the use of violence. We will never achieve the goal of zero hunger unless we also put an end to war and armed conflict. The Norwegian Nobel Committee wishes to emphasize that providing assistance to increase food security not only prevents hunger, but can also help to improve prospects for stability and peace. The World Food Programme has taken the lead in combining humanitarian work with peace efforts through pioneering projects in South America, Africa, and Asia.
Well, thank you. That Berit Reiss-Andersen reading the statement of the Norwegian Nobel Committee this morning in Oslo. And I'm so pleased we've assembled a really top panel of specialists in international peace and security to help us make sense of some of the claims in the statement and some of these deep relationships, like the notion of a vicious circle or vicious cycle between food and conflict dynamics. I'd like to introduce first our moderator, and then I'll introduce our speakers, and then I'll step back for a moment and listen to the analysis myself. Our moderator is my friend and colleague, Deborah Avant, who is the Siė Chėou Kang Professor at the University of Denver at the Korbel School. And she is the director of the Siė Chėou Kang Center for International Security and Diplomacy at the school. Deborah is a fantastic scholar in international peace and security and has done quite a bit of work on civil-military relations, on issues of global governance, on civil action in the midst of conflict. And she comes to us with a PhD from the University of California, San Diego. And Deborah's work has really also kind of, I think, addressed one of the sort of key issues around the provision of security in these environments and private security actors. And so we think of this issue in humanitarian context as well. She'll be moderating for us. And I'm really pleased to introduce our three experts. Scott Gates is with us here from Oslo, from 8 p.m. in Oslo. So thank you, Scott, for staying on late this afternoon after a very long day. Scott is a research professor at the Peace Research Institute in Oslo and a professor at the University of Oslo in the Department of Political Science. Congratulations to Scott on your election as president of the Peace Science Society in May of this year. And Scott is also the editor. I'll say, well, we have the most prestigious prize. We also have the most prestigious journal in the field, I would say the Journal of Peace Research. And Scott is the editor-in-chief of that. He's a native of Minnesota. I won't ask him if he's voting in Minnesota still or not. We'll just leave that aside, but he's a native of Minnesota and took a PhD as well at the University of Minnesota. Previously taught, well, I'll just mention this, where my sister also teaches at Michigan State University. And then our next speaker will be my friend and colleague, Pamela Aall. Pamela is a senior advisor at the United States Institute of Peace in Washington, DC, and a fellow with the Center for International Governance and Innovation. Pamela is also been very active in many years in the organization Women in International Security, WISE, as has Deborah Avant. And Pamela has a remarkable record of phenomenal books in this field. The most recent book that she co-authored with Ben Hansen and Chester Crocker is on mediation. I would recommend everyone take a look at that most recent book. Pamela's work on mediation is now a long-standing. Pamela comes to us with originally a BA, AB from Harvard University and a master's from the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University. Well, finally, I'm pleased to have the perspective of international Geneva, we could say, and the person of my, also my friend and colleague, Fred Tanner. Fred is a professor teaching now at the Graduate Institute of International and Development Studies there along the shores of Lake Geneva. And most recently was the very senior advisor to the Secretary General and the representative of Switzerland to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe in Vienna. And in that capacity, Ambassador Tanner has also done extensive work on the special monitoring mission in Eastern Ukraine. And we see the sort of connection between the sort of conditions of peace and issues of humanitarian access, including those of those monitoring conflicts. Professor Tanner comes to us with a PhD from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. And we're very pleased to have Fred here as well. So those are our speakers today and our moderator. I'll step back and turn things over to Deborah Avant, and we'll begin our expert appraisal of the 2020 Nobel Peace Prize.
Great. Thanks so much, Tim. And welcome, everybody. Glad to have you. I actually, this is, this is not something I study very much, the Nobel Peace Prize. But when Tim asked me to moderate, I did think it is an interesting example. I've done a lot of work on the role of non-state actors, or perhaps kind of surprising types of power you could see in the world, and the degree to which we all stay, sort of fixated on who's going to get the Nobel Peace Prize. Shows the ways in which these different kinds of actors that we don't really think about so much in terms of peace and security really do have this kind of agenda setting effect. So I'm really interested to hear what my colleagues have to say. As I was anticipating the event, I did sort of pore over the different people who had been nominated and wonder the degree to which the Nobel Committee was going to kind of jump into the fray with some sort of pandemic related concern, perhaps something even more controversial, which of course they have done from time to time. But it's interesting in their choice of the World Food Program, I think kind of reiterating a commitment to multilateralism. And then also something that is certainly relevant to the pandemic, but certainly not, kind of awarding some kind of recognition to particular sorts of pandemic responses. So in some sense, this is kind of a little bit of a shying away from the politics of it, I think. But I think I will stop here and actually turn it over to the people who do study this to speak a little bit more. But I just want to remind you, as they're speaking, we do have an opportunity for you to ask questions. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and please do type them in, and we will be monitoring that and using those as we turn to questions after our speakers give their opening remarks. So please jot down your questions as you think of them, and we'll hope to get to as many as possible. With that, let me turn to Scott Gates, who's going to start us off.
Thanks. I'm happy to be coming here from Norway, and with my tangential, I don't have formal connections to the Nobel Peace Center or the Nobel Institute, but being here, of course, you're regularly involved with the people, and I even know some of the people that are on the committee. And in addition, I will take the liberty to say I did vote today. I sent in my ballot, but it's my last place of residence, which is Michigan. So I voted in Michigan. And that may be more important than voting in my native state of Minnesota. And while I did get my econ degree at Minnesota, I got my doctorate at Michigan, at the University of Michigan.
That's right.
So sorry, but yeah, anyway, just to stand on the correct things. And then I'm going to add one more thing. What brought me to Norway, in addition to my wife, was I was the director for the Center of the Study of Civil War, which was quite an exciting period for studying Civil War and aspects of Civil War. And the Research Council of Norway was extraordinarily generous in funding that center, which really was a big part of my career and really changed, I think, the way that we in academia study the concept and the patterns of Civil War. I was really, really happy with the award this year. I was a bit worried about who was going to get it. But I actually know David Beasley. David Beasley was part of the PRIO endowment board. He was active in supporting the CSCW, which I was the director. He became first famous because he's the governor of South Carolina that lowered the Confederate flag and removed the Confederate flag from the state capitol. He is a Republican, but he's more of the old-fashioned variety, even if he's coming from South Carolina. He's a really great guy, a nice guy, and it was just a delight to see him practically dancing around when he received the award. I was very, very happy for him. The WFP is an amazing organization. They are regularly helping between around 90 to 95 million people with food aid. And as was announced in the short clip, in this period of COVID-19, we're talking about 120 to 135 million people that they anticipate addressing and taking care of the needs. What's also not stated there, but I do know, is WFP does more than food assistance. It also drops medical supplies and is very much engaged in medical relief, medical supply relief, in addition to food. So it's not just food, but it's also a whole array of other emergency supplies that become available. I thought that the nature of the association and where WFP policies and where food and hunger and malnutrition come into the picture was pretty well articulated. But I'm going to elaborate a little bit about it. It's basically what is articulated here is what's called the conflict trap. And the basic premise of the conflict trap is the factors that are associated or drive conflict, motivate people to fight, produce fighting, and then they themselves are the product of fighting. So you get this nature of poverty, hunger, malnutrition, motivate people and make it easier to organize groups to take up arms against the state. The war itself then in turn causes considerable degradation of food supplies and distinctly leads to food security issues and problems with malnutrition and other issues regarding hunger. And then, of course, those then fuel more conflict. So you get this vicious cycle, which is called the conflict trap. My own research has mostly focused on the consequences. I've got an article in World Development in which we assessed the Millennium Development Goals and how conflict affected the Millennium Development Goals. And Millennium Development Goal number 1 regarded malnutrition and hunger and poverty. And that of all of the whether it was only one MDG that was more profoundly affected by conflict than malnutrition, poverty, and that was actually access to drinkable water. And if we're thinking about basic human needs, it's water and food. So those clearly we have a role being played by the WFP in terms of relieving that. I've done subsequent work now on the Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs. And there we see an interesting phenomenon, and that is that the world is making tremendous progress in addressing issues like malnutrition and other things. And organizations such as the WFP are doing a phenomenal job in reducing the tremendous potential problems that can occur due to hunger and malnutrition. So even though that global progress is occurring, nevertheless, conflict has an unmistakable effect on reducing the chances regarding the SDGs. And I'll go back just as one little parenthetical comment about that, and that is the WFP is not just emergency assistance. They're very much engaged in sustainable development programs as well, so that it's not just a one-off, oh, we'll save some people right now, but they're really actively engaged in creating sustainable solutions. So if consequences are there, then of course there's causes. And we have the broader causes associated with poverty and malnutrition, but we also have more proximate causes that result in other forms of conflict. Food riots, especially in urban areas, are a big problem, especially in the MENA region, the Mideast North Africa region. Colin Hendricks, colleague of yours at Denver, has done a lot of path-breaking work on that. And I've got a paper with some economists with some additional work on that, building on Colin's work. I think the nature of the conflict trap and the role that food, malnutrition play in it is really important. And WFP is playing a very big role in mitigating and trying to limit the viciousness of the vicious circle. There is one thing that wasn't mentioned, and I think it's really important that we do mention it, and that is food as a weapon in war. Yes, but food actually is more commonly used as a means of political oppression and repression. I remember, now it's become quite a while ago, but Ethiopia, when we were all giving aid money and whatnot, is most of the famine that was occurring in Ethiopia when the Dervish was running affairs was actually politically motivated. It was not due to environmental consequences. There were indeed problems, but the real problem and the real hunger was due to an oppressive regime that was intentionally starving people, literally starving people. And I think that we can't dismiss the role of food in that regard of with respect to political repression. And then I'll just end my comments with a comment about COVID-19. That I already mentioned that there's a lot of medical supplies, and they're especially active right now. I do agree with the statement that during these times, one of the most basic ways of dealing with the disease is at providing enough nutrition. So if you're malnourished or undernourished, you are much more vulnerable to this disease, to the disease and the nature of the virus and its debilitary effects or deadly effects. So I think in that regard, this is a particularly important role. I'll also say, in terms of repression, there unfortunately are a number of regimes that are taking advantage of COVID-19 and using it to increase power for leaders and take back power from people more generally, and a retreat from democratic institutions. And that's quite a problem. So I'll just conclude by saying I really am happy. I think this is one of the awards that makes me truly happy. And that doesn't always happen with the Nobel Prize. As she noted in her address, is that there is an aspect associated with the Nobel Prize, which is not just rewarding good behavior, but it's also a signal of what we want to continue and the direction towards global policies to address issues of peace and conflict. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Scott. That's interesting. Next, we have Pamela Aall.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of you in Denver who organized this. It gave me an opportunity to actually do some concentrated thinking about the Nobel Peace Prize this year, which I found fascinating. A little research on the past and so forth. I agree with Scott. I think it was a good choice, and for a number of reasons that go beyond the ones that Scott mentioned. I kind of like the Nobel Prize for institutions just generally, because, you know, no one is a game changer by themselves. They always have a team behind them or people who made it possible for them. Even when we see, you know, the person who's the face of the change, it's actually nice to have a prize this year that recognizes a whole UN system. You know, there's been a lot of UN bashing, and this was a way, I thought, for the Nobel Committee to recognize the UN without going directly to the UN itself. And the UN has won the Nobel Prize in the past. There is also a link with WHO, which obviously was on the list this year, very controversial. But as it turns out, these two institutions have a very close relationship. So that you get a kind of a logistical connection between the two, where the World Food Program will put its phenomenal logistical abilities, to the use for WHO of getting medical supplies around. While evidently they are very, very clear that it's WHO who's in the lead. So again, it wasn't WHO, but it was, the helper institution to WHO. I also like that there is a direct link. They make an effort to make a direct link to peace and conflict. If you go on their website, they address this issue directly. It's not, the World Food Program is not an institution that I generally think of in terms of peace and conflict work in the more narrow sense that I work in it. So I was very pleased to see that, they're reaching out to in a way, my part of the field, even if I hadn't returned the favor yet, but I will. I like the fact that both the institution and the Nobel Committee actually mentioned the use of food as a weapon of war, a deliberate weapon of war. I thought it was a very, very useful for us, in the larger world to think more clearly about the systematic use. I mean, we see it in Syria, we see it in Yemen. We hear about negotiations around humanitarian pauses and whether they happen or they don't happen. I think the award really brings home what regimes are doing in terms of using that humanitarian access as a cudgel in their own fighting. So I thought that was, really right on. And I also, as Deborah Avant mentioned, I think the multilateral, the sort of the cheering for the multilateral effort to address a global problem is also great. I said I don't, it's not the first institution I think of when I think of peace and conflict. And I thought the prize was interesting. If you go through the prizes that have been given, over the last 20 years, they tend to go back and forth between peace and justice. So a lot of prizes are for people or institutions that have been directly involved in the peace process. A lot of prizes have been for institutions or people who have been directly involved in bringing change or in bringing justice to their societies. There haven't been that many prizes for humanitarian organizations. So it really allows us to think more clearly about the cause and effect of the causes of war and the effects of war. I thought Scott's explanation of that was right on. On the other hand, I happen to believe that war is largely caused by bad politics and bad leadership. That even in that vicious cycle, what you need to make that vicious cycle run is really bad leadership. That food insecurity by itself doesn't necessarily lead to wide-scale war. You just need really bad policies, and I think we all understand that. But I think about the Rohingya crisis in Myanmar, And that was a crisis. It was a huge humanitarian crisis, still is, caused entirely by bad leadership in Burma. So the other thing that I thought about in terms of the prize was like, who didn't get the prize this year? And we all had our list of institutions that we thought, well, maybe they'll get the prize. I was kind of rooting actually for journalists. There was some talk about just bringing up the to a global scale, the issue of the threat to journalists from many authoritarian societies, and also the threat of fake news, the threats that the manipulation of social media brings to all of us. But what I really started to think about was one of the definitions of who gets the Nobel Prize seems to be that you can point to something that happened in a way in the last year, that a change happened. And it kind of means that all those people who are working for peace where it's not working out, but they have worked for peace for 30 years, probably are not going to be recognized for a Nobel Peace Prize. And I'm thinking about what's going on in Belarus. I am thinking also about Alexei Navalny. Would he have gotten the Peace Prize? Probably not. But he is involved in the long game, the long process. I also thought about Fred Tanner's institution, the OSCE, which has been involved in a conflict I've learned a little bit about again this year between Armenia and Azerbaijan. For 30 years, they have led the Minsk process, and it isn't working out. Armenia and Azerbaijan are, the violence has really picked up. Does it mean that they have been a failure? I don't think so. I mean, that violence could have happened at a large scale anytime in these last 30 years. And, I think that probably their actions have, in fact, prevented frozen war. It may not have resolved the conflict, but it froze the violence. So are they going to get the Nobel Peace Prize? Probably not. And again, I think it's because it's such a long game. We're all, all of us who work in the peace area are aware of the length of time it takes to change behavior. So it's great to have a prize for people who have made an impact that you can actually see that year, but there are a lot of people who are not being noticed for that very reason. And finally, I started to think about what does winning the prize mean for the institution or person who is the laureate? And is it a good thing or is it a bad thing? And, I think if you go through the history, it is probably generally a good thing, but there's some very mixed records coming out of that list. Probably the most, shocking one was Aung San Suu Kyi, who won the Nobel Prize in 1991 and then was in The Hague last year defending her government against charges of genocide. But I was actually very pleased to see that the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Warfare, which won the prize 10 years ago, anyway, won the prize, was again in the news today because they had analyzed the poisons that had been administered to Navalny and had basically verified that they were in fact poisons. So it has helped their work, perhaps. It means that their work continues as it has before and is as useful. So the $1 million is not going to get the World Food Program very far, where they have a budget of $7 billion. But I think the recognition is, in fact, a very positive aspect. So those are my thoughts. And I'm really looking forward to hearing Fred and also the discussion.
Great, thanks so much. And I'm glad you touched on some of the issues of an organization versus a person. I'm sure we will talk more about that as we go on. Now we'll turn to Fred.
Well, thank you very much, Deborah. And also many thanks to Professor Timothy Sisk for inviting me to be part of this distinguished group. I'm also very grateful to Pamela Aall for referring to the OSCE as a potential candidate for next year's Nobel Peace Prize. We can, of course, talk about that a bit more. I think each organization has certain weaknesses and strengths. I think there's a saying that institutions actually do not fall, do not fail, but actually the member states do fail. And that's a bit the curse right now, also in Nagorno-Karabakh, where we're struggling to find some kind of common ground to get to a peaceful settlement of this very ugly conflict. I've been asked by Professor Sisk to actually follow a couple of outline here, which I will do very briefly. And of course, the first question has been about what it really means in terms of peace and war. And I think Scott has already, of course, referred to that. He came with the conflict trap and the conflict drivers. I thought a bit more about peace drivers coming from Geneva. And peace drivers, of course, would be, in my view, the respect of human rights, social cohesion, inclusive approach to conflict solving, but possibly also within the spirit of Alfred Nobel, structure, norms, rules, just a bit, some kind of order or good governance, which should be there. And of course, if we look where the World Food Program is, an environment where we don't find this kind of drivers. What we find is political settlements that are stalemated, civilian populations that are caught in a protracted conflict setting, basically human suffering. And so I think the basic assumption, in my view, of the 2020 Peace Prize has been that the work of WFP improves conditions in a conflict-affected areas, and this in turn may improve the propensity for peace. But also to combat hunger, and I was very actually happy that this topic has been mentioned for a number of reasons I'd just like to come to, but to combat hunger also falls under the concept of protection of civilians, which of course is a known concept to all of us. And that leads, of course, also to the concept of responsibility to protect. Let's not forget that R2P has this year its 15th anniversary, adopted at UN World Summit 2005, and possibly may have a kind of second wind in the next few months and years to come, who knows. And of course, just before 2005, a period of the heydays, I think, of the UN. Of course, UN got the Nobel Peace Prize 4 years before the UN and Kofi Annan, which of course reflected at the time the kind of acceptance of global governance and the UN as the guardian of that. And we should not forget, of course, that we are now this year in the 75th anniversary of the UN. And of course, there have been many speculations that indeed UN agency or even the Secretary General Guterres could receive the prize. Now, with regard to the question about these implications of prestige dimension of the prize with regard to the laureate, I'd like to make just 2 or 3 observations. And here also come back what Professor Sisk mentioned about my work I have been doing with regard to the special monitoring mission in Ukraine. It's the fact that WFP is quite an autonomous operational agency as compared to many other programs, funds and programs, of course, within the UN family. And the staff of WFP is in emerging conflicts usually the first on the ground. They're in fact the first responders, not the UN Blue Helmets or other agencies, it's WFP with all the responsibilities which come with it. they find themselves in an involving conflict situation. They have duty of care responsibilities of its unarmed staff in an active conflict environment most of the time. They have to set up or repair infrastructure to get around, to get logistical access to affected groups. They need to negotiate access to host governments, receive security guarantees, negotiate with rebel groups, and for that, they're quite known, also set up communication systems, sometimes over hundreds of kilometers, which later then will be used by the UN system coming in. And I think this kind of work also is quite precarious and dangerous, and certainly deserves recognition, which of course has been done now by the award of the Nobel Prize. Now, the third point is looking briefly about the underlying rationale of the prize as reflected in the Norwegian Nobel Committee statement. How sound is this rationale? And I would say it's very sound, which we heard from the speaker of the Norwegian Peace Committee for 4 reasons. First, I think that globally, there is a crisis in food security, but the point which was made is that it's getting worse. Actually, I quote here, it takes a negative turn. And of course, it's combined with the COVID-19 pandemic and therefore exacerbates the food crisis this year. Then the second point, which I think is very solid too, is the understanding of the statement that defeat of hunger will be a key driver for peace. And the third is that acting to prevent the use of hunger as a weapon of war, that's what Pamela already referred to, is of course, I think, an important achievement by the Security Council Resolution 2417, where actually the link between armed conflict and conflict-induced food insecurity and threats of famine has been established. And again, coming from Geneva, looking at humanitarian responsibilities, significant with this resolution is also that starvation of civilians as a method of warfare may constitute a war crime. And finally, the rationale of the statement, of course, and we have Scott who made that point already, strongly supports the SDGs. Again, SDGs, the work of WFP is very much goes beyond delivering food. It is programmatic too, and hooks very much into the broader strategic UN ambitions. Then the last point, by the way, actually in that statement, the very last sentence is quite curious, referring to the Fraternity of Nations. Now, I think that certainly comes back from the period of Alfred Nobel. And I suppose, again, that's probably the assumption that a better organized world will be a more peaceful world. And of course, I think this has very much been put in support of multilateralism, which indeed is in a very defensive mode today. So to conclude, the fourth point was the question, how now these kind of laureates, how can they advance peace from their side in a world of intersecting crises? And here, I think the key point is building resilience. Again, going beyond food security, food supply. I also looked briefly at the website today and I realized that the food supply is a kind of broad notion whereas actually the various programs look at issues of malnutrition. They look at issues where the relationship between sustainable development cannot be possible where malnutrition rages. They look at diverse, nutritious diets, all that as part of their programs and work. And of course, again, then the link to another issue, which I don't think has been mentioned so far, the WFP very much engages also in the work of climate change. Again, the assumption being the correlation between climate change and food insecurity exists because climate change leads to intensive floods, droughts, and storms, and that leads to full-blown food and nutrition crisis. With this assumption, I think, again, a lot of programmatic work has been established by the program, probably in Rome and primarily also in the field. And again, SDG is certainly an agenda which the organization will continue to carry out, being a Nobel Peace Laureate. Here, it's of course not just the issue about eradicating hunger with the SDG number 2, but also climate change, goal 5 and goal 16. With this, I'd like to conclude here. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks so much, Fred. And we do have a question from the audience. It's actually kind of a direct follow-up to something Scott said at the end, which was to give some examples of countries that are actually using COVID in ways that sort of promote democratic backsliding. I certainly have an example or two in mind, but I'm sure you do too, Scott. I didn't know if you want to take that.
Well, Hungary is one of the main ones, but Hungary isn't facing these issues. I guess to some extent, I would say India would be the prime example. There again, I don't think we're at the level of warfare. Most of the cases where I can think of where the food is involved in a war trap or other things, then we're already in a case where the state is taking advantage as much as possible. I guess it's more of the prospects and the possibilities for regimes to take more and more action. And I think this goes, I guess where I would say is this reflects what Pamela was saying about bad government. I think her comments tie nicely to the repressive aspects of using food as a weapon, not just in active, where there's an active armed rebellion, but even when there's no rebellion, but then you feed the possibilities of the future rebellion when food is used as a means of repression. And I think COVID is definitely going to be used in that way. So there's a number of African countries that are prospective places where we could see greater abuses and retreat from democratic institutions. But clear examples coming out of Africa, particularly related to COVID, they're not coming to mind. Maybe it's due to the fact that I've been at work for 14 hours now. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head.
No, that's great. That's great. So we have another question that actually relates to one of mine, which is sort of thinking about in situations where the prize goes to an organization. And, you know, we've already mentioned, it's not like this is so much money that's going to really affect the capacities of the organization in a substantial material way, but it definitely gives umph to the organization. Is it used strategically? Like, how do these kinds of recognitions kind of play out in the way the organization proceeds in the future? I don't know if any of you guys want to weigh in on that, maybe thinking a little bit about the way it's happened in the past, as well as what might be behind the particular strategy here. Don't all jump at once. Yes, Pamela, please.
Well, I really won't be able to answer that when it comes to organizations, because what I notice is that it becomes part of the narrative of whoever the laureate is. And so since most of the laureates have been individuals, you see in their, you know, their bios or whatever, it's the first thing that's listed is that they were a Nobel laureate. And I think for institutions, it has the same kind of in a way, branding value of saying, we have the good housekeeping seal of approval from the world body. And it, you know, similarly to those occasions when the UN can act as a, as a unified voice, it does bring legitimacy to the work. So, what would I like to see a big organization like the World Food Program do with its $1 million, which is not going to make that much difference in their budget? There are, fellowship programs, for instance, for young people, putting it in education, putting it in some way, bringing, the younger generation into their work, finding creative resources, looking at indigenous or local methods for providing food security and letting the rest of the world know about them. I think for an operational organization, they have so much knowledge that they keep to themselves, not because they want to keep it to themselves, but they frankly do not have time to take that knowledge and broadcast it to the rest of us. I think to use some of that money to allow the rest of us in a way to participate in their world, to benefit from their hard-won wisdom over time. My area is, mediation and negotiation. I would love to know how they negotiate their access. If they're the first responders on the ground, how do they get there? What is their methodology? I think we could learn a lot from that. So it doesn't exactly answer the question. It may just put another one on the table, but can we help them think through how to spend their $1 million?
Anybody else want to say something here? Your comment actually, Pamela, reminded me when I was doing research quite a long time ago now on the potential for private security in the Goma camps after the Rwandan genocide. The World Food Program was not held in such high stead because there were a lot of complexities in the 1990s with that kind of first response, and the strategic use of the resources they brought with them by the different warring parties. And so I do think the way that we think about their role right now as a humanitarian organization that is not beset by those kinds of concerns suggests that they have thought through how to deal with those in ways that could be really useful to think about and to reflect on, both because, I think we often fall into the trap of thinking about organizations, so it's good or bad, or people as good or bad, but to see an organization that goes through some sort of tough times and learns from it in a really productive way to sort of be at this position now, I think could be actually a really useful exercise that I hope. It sounds like a great dissertation topic for some PhD student somewhere. Fred, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just perhaps one point about the financing. The World Food Program actually has a quite an impressive annual budget, which I just looked it up today, which actually is bigger than that of the UN peacekeeping budget, which shows that here in terms of humanitarian work, there is a lot of resources, at least in terms of budget. I don't know if they got all the funds which they have been budgeted for, but I think the statement of the Norwegian Nobel Committee today explicitly referred to the funding too, encouraged that more support should be made, because of course that's what they need. I mean, they have the know-how, they need to buy equipment, they need to, as Pamela mentioned, probably also do diversify some of their activities on the ground when it comes to work also in the field of climate change and food security, etc. So I think that certainly gives them the some more legacy, some more prestige, which helps them to probably with regard to fundraising. And one other aspect, which may be perhaps a bit strange, but I think also in the fact that they are often in kind of difficult situations, having that status may help them also even with non-recognized groups, because they regularly, staff is being kidnapped. There was a famous case where an entire helicopter crew was actually abducted because, again, they're in a relatively uncertain environment. And I think perhaps having a Nobel Prize status may perhaps give them some more prestige in this kind of environment as well.
Great, thanks. Scott, did you have something?
Well,
Trying to read body language here.
I guess I'm with Pamela in I like institutional prizes, even though $1 million to most institutions doesn't make much of a, it's a drop in the bucket. It's a much more of the prestige in the legitimation of the award. And I really appreciate Fred's comments in that regard, with possibilities for greater access is possible in the future. I do think that there is some aspects of different views within the Nobel Committee as to, and I don't think that they'll give awards to institutions every year. I think there's some who feel it's very important to give it to individuals. So we don't usually see, next year is probably going to go to an individual, is my guess, or a couple of individuals, and probably my guess is more traditional kinds of views about people directly related to peacemaking efforts is my guess as to who's going to get the award next year. But I also agree with Pamela. I was actually every year Henrik, or the director of PRIO, makes forecasts as who will get the award. I think only one time in the history of 4 directors has they predicted correctly. Every year is wrong. But this year, Henrik Erdahl had predicted it was Journalists Without Borders, or which I really thought that he might have gotten that myself as well, because of the rise of populism and such things. But that didn't happen. I'm still delighted with this award. I really think it's a good award. So I don't want to.
So actually, you mentioning that we're likely to go back to something more directly related to peace and conflict goes to the next question, which was about the fact that this is looking much more at kind of root causes and things that are a few steps away from actual shooting wars, and wondering about what that might mean for the future of other kinds of unusual or sort of more further removed types of activities or organizations that you all might foresee becoming potential candidates, in the event that there isn't a backlash towards more direct recipients next year. I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on emerging areas that might be root causes and we might think about in the future.
Well, I'll put in my 2 cents on water. I think water is something that is definitely something that's underappreciated. There's notions of water conflict. Water also, rivers offer great possibilities for peace. Number of fundamentally long-lasting peace agreements have been over water. Interesting, all the wars fought between India and Pakistan, but the Indus River Pact has not a drop of water from the Indus has been diverted by India, despite all of those wars between Pakistan and India. So there's something about a fragility, but also an optimistic aspect about water agreements with river water and other things. We're seeing a big potential problem with Ethiopia building a giant dam, and then that water affecting the flow of the Nile into Sudan and into Egypt. So there's a potential for interstate conflict regarding water, but there's also prospects for peace. But in addition to those kinds of things, what I mentioned before is one of the most essential aspects of being alive is having access to drinkable water. And conflict, because of internal displacement, often brings people out of areas where they can obtain drinkable water. The potable water is not accessible, and the most vulnerable people to bad water are under 5-year-olds. Infants and toddlers are especially vulnerable, and that's when you really see the increase in infant mortality and under 5 mortality as a result of war, is because of an inability to obtain drinkable water.
Interesting. Fred, Pamela, do you have any thoughts on kind of unusual potential recipients in the future, or ones further removed from sort of direct conflict activities?
Well, perhaps, I mean, coming from Geneva, of course, the ICRC is an organization which is not really directly involved in mediation, but works very discreetly. But I understand, I think the ICRC already received at least twice, if not 3 times, the Nobel Prize, at least before World War II. I don't know if more recently as well. But I think that there are a lot of groups which are working in the kind of the fog of war, which would deserve a lot of recognition. I met a number of these like victim groups or mothers of lost soldiers, being that in the Caucasus, Eastern Europe, or elsewhere, which are very courageous groups which really work across borders, which is not always easy. But again, other organizations working across borders in conflict areas, like Amnesty International, or Journalists Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. So I think you do have quite a few, and I think it probably depends on a certain visibility which they may have in a specific context area. I just know the ICRC actually, it's one of its brands is to precisely not to be visible and to do its work discreetly on the ground and with the partners.
And I think that last point is very, very important, that it brings us back to the question of, does a Nobel Peace Prize do your work, and does it do your work good? Or does it bring unwanted attention to your work? No, I agree with everything that both Scott and Fred said in terms of, you know, where we might look for new, for future, less traditional laureates. I also, and I know relatively little about this area, but you know, the new battleground, of course, is cyber, and it would bring you back to someone who would be more traditional in the security area, but we haven't dealt in this cyberspace for very long, and so what would that kind of organization look like, and who are they? I don't know, but they must be out there.
Oh, they totally are. Actually, I was thinking about Citizen Lab, which is run by a very actually good friend of mine for a long time, who has essentially looks into these cyber oppressive actions by governments. You know, that's not the only organization, but yeah, I was actually thinking exactly along those lines, Pamela, of especially given the context of information and the importance of information for everything from democracy to how we respond to the pandemic, to even what we think about you know, health and food security, and all these kinds of things are so influenced by that sort of thing. I'm sorry I interrupted you, but
nope, you answered the question. May
Tim, do you have
I?
a question? Yeah, go ahead.
May I pose a question to my everyone who's on this program, which is we haven't outside of talking about water issues and food security issues in relationship to this prize, we really haven't mentioned climate related issues. And I am wondering what the sort of consensus of this panel is, if there is a consensus, the thought of the panel is on whether climate activists and belong in this camp, or do we need perhaps a new prize that that recognizes action that isn't directly related to peace and security, but is world changing?
Thoughts, Tim?
I'll let Scott take it. I think I'll come back in just a moment. Yeah.
Yeah. You were taking it, or I'm just sorry.
No, I was going to let you take that, Scott. I'll come back in with a few comments here, just right and try to address things.
Yeah. Well, there have been awards for climate activists before. So I think that's going to stand in the way. I don't think it prevents us from exploring the issue. I do think that if we're going to have another award with climate activism, it will be climate activism that's more directly related to peace and conflict issues, is my guess. There was a lot of pushback in, it was the award to the Kenyan woman, I forgot her name.
2004, Wangari Maathai. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There was a lot of controversy at the time. I think that controversy is less hot. A colleague of mine, Nils Petter Gleditsch, was quite provoked because he really didn't think climate related to conflict. I think most research afterwards has shown there are a number of ways that climate change drives factors that are more directly related, especially to civil conflict. I think it's pretty hard to say there's no relationship whatsoever. So I think that it's less controversial now as not being related. I think it directly is. I think, and we're going to see as the world gets warmer and warmer, more and more driving nature as people are moving, big migration that occur, displacement. Those displacements then can lead to conflict over land and other resources. It's not just between, I guess, the first thing that happens is intercommunal violence, forms of non-state violence where the state's not directly involved, but often the state does become involved. And then we've got nature of civil war and other problems associated with it. I think, and then we relate to what I was just talking about with regard to water. Of course, with global warming and climate change, there's going to be less water and drinkable water and access to drinkable water. So then, even if you think about the consequences of conflict, then climate change is going to make those even the effects and the consequences of conflict worse. And so then we're even deeper grooved into the vicious nature of the conflict trap. Certainly food too. Food production will go down.
Well, I'll jump in. I just want to thank Debbie for moderating the event, and just right along these lines would suggest that the 1970 prize to Norman Borlaug and for the Green Revolution is sort of in this sort of same vein. And there was a lot of criticism as well of that prize about whether and how advances in science lead to greater food productivity, which somehow, what is the linkage to peace? And Scott, you're right to mention the 2004 prize to Wangari Maathai and the Greenbelt movement. It's like, well, what does planting trees have to do with peace? And in summary here, I just wanted to say, yeah, that Scott had it right. I think in terms of this nature of the conflict trap, we see that food insecurity leaves young individuals, young boys, young girls, and those who on whom others rely for food, right? So we measured the dependency ratio in these countries as to see how many people live off a single salary, and so you get that one job or that one loss and you have a whole number of people food insecure. But the point is that it leaves individuals vulnerable to potential recruitment into violent or extremist groups. And so to me, the prize might have done, the statement today might have done a little more to link food insecurity to the agenda of countering violent extremism or preventing violent extremism, depending on the sort of international organization, UN ODC in Vienna more countering, UNDP more preventing, but it could have been done. But I thought Scott's comment was just right, where they did make the link, and I think it is a well-substantiated link about this notion of a vicious cycle and the role of food insecurity in that. So I really appreciated that. And Pamela's remarks, of course, were wonderful. And we all think about who didn't get the prize. And I think you're right to point out that the terms of the will from Alfred Nobel have this sort of curious phrase about who in the last year has done the most. And many historians have kind of sought to interpret Alfred's intent in that, was it for peace congresses, in that sort of era of disarmament, etc. But thinking about who hasn't won the prize and in future prizes, I would just point out that no scholar of international peace and security who spent many years and years looking through research and the kind of evidence-driven way has won the prize. I'm not sure I would put Dr. Kissinger in that category. More for diplomacy, I think was the statement. The other kind of individual or organization I would point out, and my colleagues and friends in Norway, this won't be anything new to them, are athletes. And I noted this year that the Seoul Peace Prize in Seoul, Korea, went to Thomas Bach, the president of the International Olympic Committee. And so the area I think of interest in future is this one between sport and peace. And then finally, Fred, thank you so much for your comments. There is a very much a return and interest in multilateralism. And I think you're right that the purpose of the prize this year was also to sort of, you made the remark, well, that donors can pledge to these organizations, but also there's a huge difference between what donors pledge and what's actually sent in the check or the mail. And so you made the point that the Norwegian Nobel Committee may be nudging other donors to step up with regard to the WFP. And I think this was an appropriate kind of use of the prize as well. To me, I think that this prize, my own view, I was also very pleased with the prize this year. And I think I liked it for an important reason. It goes back to the very first prize. In 1901, the Norwegian Nobel Committee awarded the prize to Henri Dunant, the founder of the ICRC, and to Frédéric Passé. And Dunant, of course, had been to the Battle of Solferino and seen the destruction, seen the devastation of conflict and war. And so to me, this prize this year in a way sort of goes back to that realization that the key mechanism globally for the prevention of war is the horror that we see from current wars. And so I thought that was an appropriate statement to make in this case. Colleagues of mine have done some projections and forecasts, modeling forecasts that would say that the combination of the pandemic and the economic fallout leave many, many contexts vulnerable to renewed or to new escalation of conflict. And so I think it's right to point out that that this kind of deep human insecurity that comes from food insecurity is related to conflict and is related to the need for peace. So with that, I want to just again thank the speakers, and particularly Fred and Scott at 8 p.m. at night, now going into later at night. I want to thank you so much for the wonderful comments. Pamela, thank you as well. And again, Debbie, for moderating. As far as the University of Denver and the Korbel School goes, the Siė Center has as its next steps a fantastic new project that really speaks to multilateralism and speaks to the issues of kind of complexities of governance, something Pamela has done a lot of work on in the current era with a Navigating the Future of Governance project, which will harness a number of specialists and academics at the University of Denver on thinking through the future of governance locally, globally, because there are deep connections there. And the Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies, I think it was Pamela mentioned that the consequences of COVID have been seen as well in the area of human rights. And certainly the question of human rights and the kind of problem of growing autocracy globally will be the subject of a major conference that the Institute will be putting on in early 2021. So before I completely conclude, though, I want to thank my colleague Gina Janone for her work in helping organize this webinar today. And would also say that we're planning to put together a short write-up of the event today, and we'll be publishing that on our just launched Institute for Comparative and Regional Studies website. So with that, again, I want to thank everyone today. I was so pleased with the analysis here. I think we do have an expert appraisal, and I hope my colleagues there at the Nobel Institute also sort of see that the experts, fortunately this year, agreed with the committee and agreed with, for the most part, agreed with the committee's rationale. So once again, thank you everyone for your participation in this webinar, and watch the space for our next one. Thank you so much.
Bye, everyone.